5, 6, 7, 8.
Hi EXers, welcome to the EX Podcast episode number 22. This is your host, Stefan Vincent. I've started this podcast because I believe that companies have to think of themselves as employment brands if they hope to attract and retain talent. The podcast brings a different lens to the employee experience, a brand and customer experience angle rather than a traditional human resources angle. Our guests, all thought leaders and disruptors in the EX space in their own way, come to this show to debate, discuss, and share best practices on the key components that foster employee engagement and strengthen company culture, and also to spark the conversation on how to create positive employee experiences. One size doesn't fit all. What Airbnb or Google do around the employee experience may not be applicable in a smaller company. This is what this show is all about. Sharing stories of companies of all sizes, not only to show that EX doesn't require a large budget or a large team, but also that there isn't one recipe. Each company can find its own way through the EX journey. Today's guest is Don MacPherson. Don is a partner for global talent marketing at Aon Hewitt. Aon Hewitt is a leading global professional services firm providing a broad range of risk, retirement, and health solutions. Today with Don, we will mainly talk about a report that Aon Hewitt recently released on the 2017 trends in global employee engagements, which includes how he defines engagement and what are the drivers of employee engagement. How does employee engagement impact business outcomes? What are the things he's seen that successful companies do in the employee engagement space? What are some of the components of a successful employee experience, and how technology will impact the future of work? This episode is brought to you by Fusion Alliance. Fusion Alliance delivers holistic solutions fusing together data, digital, and technology to redefine customer experiences and move your ideas to execution. That's why businesses across multiple industries have relied on Fusion's expertise and partnership for over 25 years. For more information, visit fusionalliance.com. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Don. If you get a chance, please make sure to review the podcast on iTunes. You can open the iTunes app and type in Stefan Vincent or EX Podcast, and you will find us there. And last thing, if you want to send me feedback, suggestions for future topics or guests, you can reach me at svincent@exsummit.com or on Twitter at EX_summit. All right, let's get to it. Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the EX Podcast. Today's guest is Don MacPherson. Don is Partner Global Talent Marketing at Aon Hewitt. Aon is a leading global professional services firm providing a broad range of risk, retirement, and health solutions. Don, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure to be here.
Tell us a bit more about your company and your current role at Aon.
Well, as you mentioned in the outset, Aon is a big company. It's a global company, and we specialize in consulting around risk, retirement, and health. And within the retirement part of the business is a business unit called Talent Rewards and Performance. And that's the part of the organization that helps our clients get the best out of their employees. So I work within the talent practices. I have responsibility for global talent marketing, which includes the business units for leadership, for culture and engagement, and for our assessment practices. And really what we're focused on is helping organizations to identify the right talent for their organization to engage them, to surround them with an effective culture and the ideal culture that they want, and then to surround and develop the leadership that is leading those employees.
Very interesting. So before we get a bit deeper on that topic, you recently released a report on the 2017 trends in global employee engagement. And the report highlights that some of the gains made in 2016 have been partially erased. Political, technological environments have increased the level of anxiety in the workplace. Can you expand a little bit on this?
Right. And you're right in that actually employee engagement has been on the rise since 2012. So we had several years of improvement. We went from about 58% of employees being engaged in 2012 to 65%. And then in the last year, it's dipped down to 63%. And the way that we capture this information, we have a global database that is from employees of around the world, clients of ours, about 5 million employees. So really, really large data set. And we're able to look at the different regions around the world and the global population as well. And when we saw that engagement dropped for the first time since 2012, we started to speculate as to why that might be, and we started to look at what is driving engagement. And what we came up with is two things that are causing anxiety. One is the rise of populism. And it's not just in the United States with the Sanders campaign and with the Trump campaign, but it's in the Philippines, and we found it in the United Kingdom with Brexit and continental Europe. Lots of countries are going through these populist movements, and that can be very unsettling for people because with populism there comes this uncertainty and anxiety to people who are in established roles and to the status quo. So that's one of the things that is causing anxiety. And to even expand on that a little bit, one of the reasons why the world has been so successful over the last couple of decades, and we've had great growth, is that there's been free movement of people and capital. So movement to different countries for both of these things, people and capital. And when you think about populism, particularly with like Brexit, or if we're talking about erecting walls and maybe stopping or ceasing trade agreements, that can cause anxiety, and that anxiety finds itself in the workplace, and it can stunt the ability to bring our best to work. So that's the populism side of it, and the data would support that, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in a few minutes. The other piece, though, is this idea of rapid technology advancement. And it seemed like at the beginning of this year, it was almost impossible to turn on the radio or turn on the television and listen to the news and not hear about a new technology that is displacing some worker or some type of job. And so you have driverless cars and drones, artificial intelligence, virtual reality, all sorts of new technologies. And lots of employees kind of see these new technologies and say, hey, I can see a day when this technology will threaten my job. And when you feel that fear, it's really difficult to be your best self at work and your best self at home. So these are two of the big macro trends that we feel are putting pressure on employees' abilities to be their best.
That's interesting. So before we get a bit deeper on that topic, there are many different ways to define what engagement means. Now, Aon's definition is interesting to me. And so how do you define engagements, and what are the drivers of employee engagement?
We define engagement as the state of emotional and intellectual involvement that motivates employees to do their best work. And when people are engaged, they're psychologically invested in their organizations. And so just think about that for a moment. Psychologically invested. I've been an entrepreneur for about 20 years, and what I wanted from people as I brought them into our organization was for them to act like an owner. They may not be an owner, but they're invested as an owner is. And that's very powerful. And when we're able to determine how engaged somebody is by asking them what they say about the company. Are they advocates for the organization? Do they say positive things to their friends and to their family? Are they loyal? Are they looking to stay with the organization for a long time? And when they're at work, are they striving to do their best? So that's our say, stay, and strive model. Based on how people respond to these questions around say, stay, and strive, we're able to determine how engaged somebody is, from actively disengaged all the way up to our highly engaged category. So that's how we define it, and that's how we measure it. What drives engagement is different. What drives engagement is actually changing, and it's really fascinating how it's changing. What traditionally has driven engagement would be things like recognition or personal accomplishment, career development, or confidence in the organization, or maybe even pay fairness, rewards. Those are the things that have traditionally driven engagement. But our research from this study that we released, we found that the number one driver of employee engagement, and this is globally, this is around the world, number one is rewards and recognition. And as we looked at that further, so number one, this is very, very rare that rewards or pay would be at the top of the list. Mm-hmm. But when we looked at it a little bit deeper, we found that it wasn't just pay or bonus structures or recognition, but it was pay fairness, which supports this idea around populism. A lot of the reasons why populism has become so popular is there's a segment of population within many countries that feel that the economic rules of the game are rigged against them or stacked against them. And so this idea of pay fairness supports that. Many people are upset around how much executives or CEOs are making compared to the lowest wage earning employees at an organization. So that's very fascinating. Employee value proposition was the second strongest driver of engagement. Senior leadership is the third strongest, which is very, very interesting because oftentimes it's the manager, or at least conventional wisdom would say it's the manager who owns engagement, who has the ability to drive engagement the most. But we're finding senior management or senior leadership is even more important than the direct manager. And then to round out the top five, we found career opportunities, which is often seen as a top driver. That was number 4. And then an interesting one around enabling infrastructure. And this is really helping employees remove barriers so they can do their job more effectively, provide them with tools and resources to be effective within their job. So those are the top 5 drivers: rewards and recognition, employee value proposition, senior leadership, career opportunities, and enabling infrastructure.
Let's talk a little bit more about the North America for now. Are there differences maybe in order, or do you see the same 5 top trends in North America compared to the rest of the world?
In North America, and we define North America for the sake of this report as the United States and Canada. So we've got Mexico within the Latin America region. But within North America, we do have a different order, but there's overlap in the top 5. Not complete overlap, but there is overlap. So number 1 within North America is enabling infrastructure, which is fairly surprising. Employee value proposition is number 2, just like globally. Rewards and recognition is number 3. Senior leadership, number 4. And then this one is a new one. Performance management is showing up as the 5th strongest driver or greatest opportunity for organizations to improve engagement.
So when you work with companies on some of those topics, what are some of the challenges that many of them are facing when it comes to what should we do if we have let's say they say we have an issue with a low level of engagement with our employees? What are the first things that they should look at when they are thinking about implementing some of those initiatives?
It really depends on the organization.
That's a good start.
So it's almost like I would relate it to every human being is different and every organization is different. Like there are many, many similarities, but if we're really going to understand your organization, we have to measure it, we have to assess it. And it's almost like going to the doctor, right? If you went to the doctor, the doctor's going to give you a physical, really understand what your health is like. And then if I went to the doctor, it's going to be the same battery of tests, but we're going to get different outcomes. Well, in this case, we're the doctor, and so we really need to understand what the health of the organization is like. So starting with an assessment or an engagement survey is a great place. And from there, we can start to identify these things. What are your top drivers as an organization? And how can we start to pull on the levers of those drivers to make the organization more effective and make engagement more pervasive within the organization? So is it rewards and recognition? If that was the number one driver within your organization, we're going to really explore that and start to identify what are some of the changes that we can make. Maybe it's a leadership issue. Maybe your senior leadership has one set of priorities, but your managers have a separate set of priorities. Well, we need to get that in alignment. So it varies. Some of our clients have issues around their hiring process and what recruiters might be telling potential employees and then what they're delivering once they're hired. So every organization, while they might look a lot alike on the outside, they have their own set of issues, and we really need to diagnose that before we start to tell them or advise them what levers they need to pull.
In your research, did you look at what if there are different engagement drivers from one generation to another? We talk a lot about the millennials feeling entitled and wanting to get everything right away or get promotion maybe a year or a couple of years after they start in a job. Have you seen some differences among the engagement drivers from, let's say, boomers to Gen Xers to millennials?
It's an interesting question, and I've gotten it a lot over the last 10 years or so since millennials have come into the workplace. We didn't look at it very closely with this particular study, but we've looked at it in the past. And what I can say is that people and what drives people are pretty similar. And so let's look at boomers and millennials, for example. What drives them would be pretty much the same, with the exception of where they are with their stage in life.
Yes.
A boomer might really crave security and safety and that stability, knowing that their job is going to be there in 5 or 10 years if they're looking to retire in that time frame. Whereas a millennial, somebody who's 26, 28 years old, they know that very likely where they're working is not their last stop. And so they may crave or want career development over this stability and security. But, job security might be number one for a boomer, but they still want career development opportunities. They still want to learn and get better at what they're doing, just like a millennial might want. It's just the order that might be different. The other difference is frequency of conversation or expectations. So the older we get in our careers, probably the less we need to be recognized, the fewer times a year we need to have career development conversations. You probably start to understand what fills you with a sense of personal accomplishment. But the younger we are in our tenure or in our careers, we do want more frequency around when we're getting recognition or having career development conversations. So if I was advising a leader or a manager who has a lot of millennial employees and who has been used to managing some older employees, I would just say the principles are the same, but ramp up the frequency with which you're having these conversations. Ramp up the frequency with which you're recognizing employees, because that helps build trust, and it reinforces the behavior that you're recognizing and that you want them to repeat.
That communication and rhythm of communication piece is interesting. I was talking to on this podcast a few weeks ago with a millennial expert who actually advises companies on how to better embrace the millennial generation. And she was saying that typically, especially boomers, when they don't hear feedback, that means that everything is going well. While the millennials, if they don't hear feedback for 2 weeks, they freak out thinking that something is wrong with them. It's an interesting conversation around, how much communications do we need in the organization? What's the frequency of it? And what do we need to share? Do we need to have very candid feedback? Do we have to be more of politically correct feedback? And I think generations relate differently to the type of open communication or not so open communication.
Right, and I think with the millennials, in fact, there would be data to support this. With millennials, technology has shifted formed their expectations. So when you can post something and get feedback very quickly, they kind of have some expectations around feedback at work being similar or having a greater frequency, whereas my generation and older generations probably didn't have that. And then the other thing is just where they are in their careers. The youngest millennials, what are they, 22, 24 years old? So they probably need much more frequent feedback just to make sure that they are doing things the right way. Because if you wait until the performance review, that can be months and they could be on the wrong track, and that needs to be dialed in.
Yeah, there's often a big question coming up as well when we talk about employee engagements and employee experience initiatives. Is how, first of all, what is the impact on business outcomes of employee experience initiatives? And the second question is, how do you measure the ROI of a company spending and investing in the employee experience? Have you done some research, or do you have stories to share when you work with companies on those initiatives or those topics?
Yes, and I'll address the first part of the question, the business impact. Engagement is related to or correlated to many, many different things. Safety, quality, individual performance, team performance, company performance, turnover. The one that CEOs want to hear about and CFOs want to hear about, though, are financial results, right? And one of the studies that we've done, it found that a 5-point increase in employee engagement relates to a 3-point revenue growth the next year. So there's a big influence. If you get engagement right, if you improve employee engagement, you will financially benefit from this. And what's exciting as we think about big data or smart data or however you want to phrase it is the ability to start to link these things together. And it really extends across the employee life cycle. How are we assessing employees, and how are the assessments or the data from assessment being related to employee engagement, which should be related or linked to employee performance, which is linked to financial performance. We're starting, and Aon has a people analytics practice that is helping organizations connect these dots so they can see how is the assessment process or the engagement process or elevation and engagement helping the organization be more profitable, grow revenue, retain employees, all these business outcomes that we want.
So talking about people data and people analytics, what are the things that organizations should look at when they try to, first of all, collect and then leverage data from the employees?
Well, that's a difficult question for two reasons. One is privacy, and the other is what's available. In an ideal world, we would want our data to be very clean, very accurate, but that's not the case with most organizations. So a starting point when we would work with a client is really just understanding what data they have available to them, what the data integrity would be like, and then making sure that if we're going to use the data, that it is clean data, that it's accurate. So that's the starting point. If it was the ideal world or scenario, we would have all sorts of data, including some data that might be private. So, one of the interesting findings that I read about recently was there was a significant correlation between the distance somebody lives from work and how long they might stay at the organization. So if somebody's commute was over a certain number of miles, the likelihood that they would leave the organization started to spike. Well, most organizations aren't thinking about that when they're thinking about people analytics. So from a data scientist perspective, most data scientists are going to say, give me more data than you think I need, and then I'll start to identify which ones are most relevant and which ones we are most likely to start to really understand what's driving what. The other thing that I mentioned is privacy. Mm-hmm. So I think this is going to become a huge issue in the next several years, because what we're starting to collect within our organizations is really the tip of the iceberg compared to what we will be able to collect. And I'm thinking about the massive amount of data that we'll be collecting from, let's say, wearable technologies or data from the Internet of Things or virtual reality. We will be able to start collecting mountains and mountains of data, or even think about network analysis and how are we communicating within the organization, or natural language processing. All of these different ways of understanding the employee experience. We will have access to this information. What we do with it is a really, really interesting moral dilemma. We can do all sorts of things with it, but is it the right thing to do? And so the advice that I would personally give to organizations is look at it at a macro level and not a micro level. So don't start identifying individual employees, but look for macro trends within the data, and then start making your changes at that macro level. The minute an organization starts to use this mountain of information to hire and fire or promote individual employees, then they cross the line, and that's where their culture is going to get stung. It's really, really going to hurt them, and they'll only be able to do it one time, and then it becomes public, and their brand is going to be significantly damaged.
To stay on the people data topic, because it's a fascinating topic for me. Do you need to be a large company to be able to leverage employee data, or can you do this when you are a, let's say, mid-size or smaller size company?
You can do it at a mid-size, and the way that I would define mid-size is 1,000 to 5,000 employees. People at Aon might define it to be up to 10,000 or 20,000 employees. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, mid-size would be 1,000 to 5,000 employees. You absolutely can do this. There should be enough data that you can collect. Doesn't mean an organization is collecting the data, but you can collect in order to start to integrate it and tell a more holistic story about your talent. And I'm talking about all sorts of things, from performance data, onboarding effectiveness, exit surveys. You start bringing in network analysis. You start looking at who's communicating with whom and how long what the length of an email might be or length of a telephone call. If you have access to that sort of information, there's all sorts of analytics that you can run. Whether it's meaningful or not is really dependent on the quality of the data and the quality of the data scientist involved.
And as you said, there is no one recipe around employee experience and employee engagement. It really depends on what each company is about and how the company works as an organization. But if you were to pick 2 or 3 main metrics to measure the impact of engaged employees to business outcomes, what would be those 2 or 3 metrics? You mentioned earlier that at a very macro level and general level, an increase of 5% in employee engagements typically generates a 3% in revenue growth. So what are the 2-3 main metrics that companies should think of when they want to find ways to tie engagements to business outcomes?
Well, if my goal is to have a very, very highly engaged workforce, and therefore grow and have financial success, there are a couple of things that I'm not going to skimp on. Number one, the hiring process has to be really mature. And I don't think a lot of organizations understand that the quality of people that they're bringing in is directly related to the quality of the hiring process that they have. And so I would almost always advise a company, if I haven't had an opportunity to work with them and I don't know a ton about them, to make sure that they get hiring right, because it's a whole lot easier to turn away somebody who is not the right fit or who may not be predisposed, have a predisposition to be engaged. It's better to turn them away than to try to engage them once they're a part of the organization. You just waste so much time and energy on that. And so getting the hiring process right, and I work with our assessment solutions practice, assessing for engagement and assessing for fit and assessing for personality. These are really critical to getting the hiring process right and having that mature and developed process. So that's the first place that I would start. And then the second place is another practice that I'm working with, which is leadership. Particularly senior leadership, but also manager capabilities. I'm going to make sure that we have very, very capable people in all roles within the leadership team, but especially within the executive team. And then I'll even go further on that, ensuring that that leadership team is aligned and is rowing in the same direction. So I have this really interesting visual. If you can imagine 2 leaders in a canoe, and they're paddling like crazy, so they're really, really engaged. But if they're facing in opposite directions, the organization's not going anywhere, or the boat or the canoe is not going anywhere.
Right.
Well, we need to make sure that those leaders are pointed in the same direction and are rowing or paddling to the goal. So those are the 2 pieces of advice that I would give organizations: is make sure you're hiring the right people and you've got a great hiring process in place. And then when you get those people within your organization, make sure they're surrounded by highly capable, aligned leaders.
So staying a little bit on the same topic here, in your work and in your research, what are the things you've seen that successful companies do in the employee engagement space?
Well, like I said, it starts with assessing talent and having a great hiring process, but it continues through the employee life cycle. So once somebody is brought into the organization, are they being onboarded effectively? We can do a great job of identifying the right people, but then if somebody's brought into the organization right away they're not welcomed within the organization, or they're not being trained within or to do their job. They're not being set up for success. We as new employees come in with enthusiasm. We don't have engagement yet.
Right.
And it's really the role of that onboarding process to convert that enthusiasm into engagement. And so that onboarding process is really, really important. And onboarding can differ greatly by firm. The onboarding for one firm might last 90 days, whereas a really technical job, it might be a year or 2 years. But understanding what that onboarding process is like and making sure that it's effective is really important to starting to engage employees and build that loyalty, build that advocacy that you want. We found that when an employee, within the first 90 days, if they say that the job is not as expected or the way that it was described to them in the hiring process, they're almost 3 times more likely to leave within the first year. And so making sure that the hiring process and the onboarding process are strongly linked is important. We talked about surrounding by great leadership. That's crucial, without a doubt, from managers all the way up to the CEO. I don't think, I know that organizations on average do not spend enough making sure they have capable leaders and focus enough on developing their leaders. I would also make sure that people understand what drives employee engagement. We did some research a couple of years ago around just understanding what employee engagement is. So we asked a panel of about 2,000 U.S. employees if they knew what employee engagement is. And half of them said yes, half of them said no. So they self-identified.
Yeah.
And if you ever have done any research, when self-identification is a part of the equation, we know that we inflate what we think we might know. Mm-hmm. So that 50% is probably higher than it actually is. And when we looked at the data by people who manage other people, it's only 65%. So about a third of all managers don't know or can't identify what engagement is, which means they don't know what drives engagement or how to use those drivers of engagement.
Yes.
So we really need to make sure that, sorry about that, we need to make sure that leaders understand what engagement is, what drives engagement, how to utilize those drivers of engagement. And then I would say, sorry about that. I would say a couple of other things that organizations should be doing is choosing who managers are wisely. So instead of elevating the best individual contributor, the best salesperson to be sales manager, really look at what the requirements of the job is for that manager and making sure that there's a good fit there. Another area is focus on the culture. We talk a lot about employee engagement, but we don't focus on, do we have the ideal culture necessary for our organization to compete now and in the future? And then the last thing that I will talk about outside of rewards, because I would say that's a driver of engagement, is just agility. How agile are our employees? How change ready are they? What has made us successful to date, and what's required for success in the future? And do we have an agile employee population to get us there? So those are a handful of things that I would say successful companies do to make sure that they're relevant in the future, that they're bringing in people and engaging them and setting themselves up for the business outcomes that they want.
Yeah, those are very good points. Now, let's switch back to what we were discussing at the very beginning around technological advances that may have impacted the level of engagement for the last year or so. There's a lot of discussion around automation, artificial intelligence, and how they may reduce jobs available. I'm not a big fan of this vision because I really believe that whatever new technologies come in, they're going to maybe get some jobs obsolete, but they will also create other jobs, and it's just a migration from some skill sets to newer skill sets. But it's sort of a really equal equation from the number of jobs lost to the number of new jobs created, in my opinion. What's your take on this, and how do you see through all the research and work you do with the companies, how do you see technological advances impacting the future of work, basically?
Well, it's going to impact the future of work. I wrote a blog post and put it up, I think, Thursday of last week, and the title of it is very provocative. And because of the Labor Day weekend, I titled it, "Is Labor Day Dead?" And it sounds very, very, dystopian or kind of like a doomsday type thing. But in it, I argue that while all of these technologies are going to change the way we work and will eliminate jobs, I argue that our organizations and as individuals, we don't have to become obsolete. But it really requires a level of agility, as I was mentioning,
yes,
and change readiness at the organization level to adapt and to thrive in the future. And so if an organization feels like, okay, we've been successful doing this for the last 10 years, and we're going to continue doing it for the next 10 years, and they've got blinders on and they're not looking at some of these trends, they're probably going to be disrupted by somebody who can do it cheaper, somebody who can do it better, somebody who can do it faster. That's just a very Charles Darwinian world, but it's absolutely true. But those organizations that are looking at the future trends and are setting up the organization have looked at their change readiness within the business units that might be affected, or as an organization overall, they're preparing for it. They're going to weather the storm, no doubt about it. And I go on to say, in the U.S., unemployment is about 4.3%. And there have been technology advances, for decades.
Yes.
For years and years. And yet only 1 in 25 people looking for a job don't have one. So we've been able to adapt to date. It's just that the rate of change has accelerated, and we have to do some analysis at an individual level and make sure that we're out of our comfort zone in order to adapt individually, and the same thing goes from an organizational perspective as well.
And what's interesting is, so basically, as a student, whatever you learn in school or in college becomes obsolete and irrelevant just a few years after that because of new technologies, softwares, automating the work that required a few people in the past to be able to accomplish. Now you can do this in just a matter of minutes or seconds, and it's done by computers or by a software. So there is space, because we were talking earlier about the needs for employees to find growth within organizations. So there's a way for organizations to use that technological advancements in general to be able to provide growth opportunities and learning opportunities for employees to develop new skill sets.
Yeah, without a doubt. And again, I think it comes down to the agility and the desire at an individual employee level. Is this individual willing to make changes? And, there have been examples. I've worked with people who just said, no, I think my skill set is still relevant, and the world passes them by. It just does. Unfortunately for them, it does. But for people who are willing to spend some time analyzing themselves and the world around them and trying to determine, really honestly, am I threatened by external changes or innovative technology? Somebody who's willing to get comfortable being uncomfortable. I think that's so important. So, people who are agile and people who are change ready, they don't spend all of their time doing things that they know how to do. They challenge themselves. They spend time in their discomfort zone or outside their comfort zone. And then, doing a self-assessment on your willingness to change. Everybody knows that. I kid that that everybody knows somebody who needs to change, but most people are unwilling to make changes themselves. But what we have to change. It's absolutely critical. And think about doing your job without a smartphone, or doing your job without internet access, or a laptop computer, or whatever technology you're using today to enable yourself. You probably weren't using it 10 years ago or 20 years ago. You definitely weren't using it 20 years ago. So you adapted. And the more willing you are to adapt and change and predict what's going to might disrupt you in the future, the more relevant you're going to be, and the more you're going to avoid becoming obsolete.
To stay on the technology topic, but to circle back a little bit about what we're discussing about data and how companies should use data at the macro level but not at the micro level. Technology has allowed brands and companies to interact on a more personal and customized level with their customers and consumers. How do you see technology advances impacting the way organizations treat and customize the experience with their employees?
I think it will have a huge impact on it. And I also believe that employees are going to be willing to give up some data if it makes them safer, if it makes them more effective, if it's going to improve their skills, if it's going to position them for a promotion. And so what we need to do is make sure that the data that we are using to understand the employee experience not only benefits the organization and leaders within the organization, but benefits the employees. If we do that, then employees are going to be more willing to give up the data and allow the organization to use it to benefit them, leadership, and the organization.
Okay, so we're getting close to the end, and typically at this time in the podcast, I like to ask a few personal questions to our guests so that our listeners can get to know them a bit more intimately. So we've talked a lot about the present, the future, the past. If you had the ability to go back in time, when or which era would you go back to?
Well, I've always been very, very interested in the 1960s. So I've been fascinated by the Vietnam War, the huge cultural change that the 60s brought onto us, and the music of the 60s. I would like to have attended Woodstock, and I think that would have been a very interesting time to live in. And to be honest with you, it's almost like we're living in a similar time now, with lots of social disruption and maybe a divisive country, but the 60s would have been my choice.
Okay, that's interesting. It's not that far back.
No, not that far back. Yeah, absolutely. I like, to be honest with you, I like electricity and plumbing and some creature comforts. So I don't want to go too far back.
Okay.
You start going back 100, 200 years and,
it's not as fun.
It's not as appealing, right?
All right. What is the essential item that you always bring with you when you go on vacation?
Dental floss.
It's the first time I've heard of it.
Yeah. Yes, I am a little obsessive about dental hygiene, and so it's been years since I went to sleep without flossing. Of course, the passport is important, credit card and cash, but number 4 on the list is always dental floss. It's the list of things. I think if I have those 4 things, I can go anywhere in the world because I can buy or charge anything else that I might need. But dental floss is not always readily available in a lot of the countries that you might travel to. So my choice is dental floss.
Okay.
And my dentist will be happy to hear that.
I'm sure he would. And the final question, what is your favorite food and why?
Sushi.
Sushi.
And yeah, I love sushi. I could eat it at least weekly. What I like about it is I love the taste, and I feel extraordinarily refreshed afterwards. And it's just my favorite thing. And you have lots of variety within sushi, so that's it. And I've been to Japan one time, and I've just absolutely fell in love with the food there. It's magnificent.
What is the way for our listeners to follow you and Aon on social media, and how can they access your reports?
The best place to find me on social media, on Twitter, it would be at MacPherson_D. That's MacPherson_D as in Don. Or you can find me on LinkedIn. Just look for Don MacPherson and at Aon. You can find most of our research on Aon Hewitt's LinkedIn page, but to really find all of this is the easiest way to find our engagement research. If you go to aon.com/engagement, all of our thought leadership is there, from our reports to managing engagement in times of change. We do all sorts of social media from there as well, blogs. So that's the best place to find us.
All right. Well, thank you for your time today and sharing some of your research with us. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me again.
Thanks for tuning in to the EX Podcast. If you want to learn more, visit our website at expodcast.com. If you want to find out more about our next conferences, go to exsummit.com. Finally, you can also find my manifesto on business to employee or B2E branding at b2ebranding.co. See you next week.